I'm Thomas. You might know me by the name Tokamu on social media. I am going to show you how I integrate TouchDesigner in my workflow. And the first premise I'm going to give is that TouchDesigner is only part of my workflow. And the whole goal of this talk is going to, I don't know, give you some inputs to approach 3D using the most tool as possible. And that means exploring boundaries outside TouchDesigner and maybe using TouchDesigner as a final folder to contain everything you can create outside of it. I come from not a really expert point of view on this program. I learned it like a couple of years ago, thanks mostly to Bileam's tutorials, which I think most of you are in the same situation. And yeah, 3D is I find it very complicated to come up with complex stuff. So I usually approach TouchDesigner as I already said, something that contains many things that can be renders. So directly not making anything 3D on TouchDesigner and just displaying the renders I did on other softwares, which I'm gonna get into in a moment. Or just directly still working in a 3D environment, but using objects that I generated outside of TouchDesigner. So now I'm gonna share my screen, if that works. Yes, this is working. Yes, this is working.
All good.
Okay, this is my super professional PowerPoint, as you can see. Okay, so I think I'm gonna just jump right into some examples. I'm gonna start from TouchDesigner and then open a few other softwares to show you what I do in 3D. So, okay. I'm gonna start from this one, which is the most accessible to everybody because it starts from a project that Bileam made. It's called orthographic geometry, I think, something. If you search orthographic on his channel, you immediately are gonna find it. It's just a couple of basic shapes, which can be chosen here, and they move in this fashion, pretty straightforward. But the concept that I want to explain here is how to use 3D only as input and experiment only after the 3D part. So on TouchDesigner, the 3D part comes before the render, which is what you're seeing on the right side of the screen. And the left side is the final result. So this is one of the main approaches on TouchDesigner with 3D, which is just keep it as simple as possible when it comes to geometry, because as some of you might know, SOP operators, which handle 3D geometry, are pretty hard on the hardware. Since I'm working with a laptop, I can't really afford very complex networks with geometries. So I keep it 2D. I use again, 3D as input, and I play around with displacement, noise, and kind of, yeah, treat 3D as 2D. And then next example, another safe, for the hardware at least, safe approach to 3D is using point clouds. Oh, 1 second. Okay, here we go. Point clouds are objects, which in this case are generated outside of TouchDesigner, and they have the prefix .obj. So anything that is obj, actually even other formats are accepted. can be opened with the point file in top, which, if you're a little bit familiar with the basics, tops are just image operators. So it's kind of a cheap trick to create actual 3D geometry using 2D operators. And since they're treated as images, this is the actual point cloud displayed in a 2-dimensional plane, which is just giving you coordinates of every single point of the point cloud. So in this case, if I switch between these two inputs, which is the first shape and this is the second shape, if I morph between these two, I get this. It's interesting, I guess. So yeah, and this example shows that you're not limited to working with subs, because in this case, subs are just giving you one square, which translated here is one small dot in the point cloud. So it's not really working that much in the 3D environment. So this is pretty cool. You could set up like 20 of these point files and have each one being switched between different sets, and you can control each one with maybe something like a MIDI controller like this one, and just assign every knob to one switch, and you can just endlessly come up with different transition between different shapes. You can probably mess this up even more, since you're not messing up the geometry, you're messing up the actual image. You can play around with image distorters, which most of the time don't really work that nice, as you can see, but sometimes something works. And I think that's the main philosophy behind TouchDesigner, at least for me, that I'm really not an advanced user of this program. I don't really know what I'm doing most of the time. I think that's a key element. All right, I'm gonna go through the next example. Yeah, this is even more basic example. Here I'm doing the opposite as the first example. I'm just starting from a 2D input, which in this case is video footage, and translating the brightness of the pixels into height of the displacement of the mesh. Again, this is nothing new. If you are a bit familiar with the basics of this program, is nothing really that complicated, but I like to treat TouchDesigner with this very cheesy expression: think before the box, not outside, because we heard that so many times. But before the box, it's a nice way to think about it. Like, don't really, at least for me, it works not using TouchDesigner as something that generates, but something that takes an already interesting input. I'm gonna switch between another. I like this one. This is all camera footage I did with some kind of weird glass panel, which was a little distorted, so it made this cool effect. And it's even cooler when translated on 3D. I mean, it's a very cheap effect, but if you just experiment with interesting material to play with, you kind of might get in interesting places. Again, here you can morph and blend between the inputs. You have this nice, smooth, organic morphing. Okay, I'm gonna take a sip of water. All right, now I am going to show you how I like to generate the objects I use on TouchDesigner, like the point clouds I showed you before. With 3 examples, I'm gonna go quickly through them. First example is download photogrammetry objects or photo scans. I hope you are kind of familiar with them. If not, you should really get into the world of photo scans and photogrammetry. And this is downloaded by a very handy website, which is called minifactory.com/scantheworld, which is probably the biggest photo scan public library online. And it's a blessing. It's so great. You have like thousands of scans from all around the world, from a lot of museums and historical museums, but also like, how do you say, a lot of archives of animals, skeletons, bones. You can't get enough of these, and they're all free. You don't even have to make an account. You can just download 100 of these, put them in a software and try to like cut them up and make like interesting collages of meshes if you want. So yeah, this is the first and easiest example to have interesting material to work with, 3D material that is. Second example is you can make your own photo scans. These are 2 examples of some of I did. Oh, okay. This is very low effort. I did this with my phone's camera. If you don't know how photo scans work, you just use a camera. You take a lot of pictures all around an object. This is a stack of chairs in my house. I took a lot of bad photos of these chairs all around. You need to take a lot of pictures. The more you take, the better it is. This is a slightly better example. This is a pumpkin. I use a DSLR camera, and you get also the texture. It's pretty cool. And to have these pictures turned into these photo scans, you need this. It's called Mushroom. Again, it's free. There are also other alternatives. It just converts a set of pictures and turns them into objects. And yes, I really like to. This is, by the way, I'm using Blender here. This is my main program apart from TouchDesigner. But I mean, everything else works. I find Blender to be the easiest, and there is the most material resources online to learn it. I highly suggest to learn something like Blender to go along with TouchDesigner. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. All right, third example. This is my favorite because nobody is familiar with this. This is my secret weapon. I'm gonna give away. This is my biggest, one of my biggest tools when it comes to generating interesting 3D structures. These objects were not made in Blender and were not made using photogrammetry, but using a software which is like 20 years old or something like that. It's called Mandelbrot 3D. Maybe somebody knows it, but I rarely see it around. It's used to make fractals. And yeah, you are all familiar with fractals. I mean, we all seen these very, I mean, most of them look kind of, I don't know, corny. And it's not very inspiring when it comes to, I don't know, approaching abstract art because it's a very singular aesthetic. It looks like you can't really play around with fractals, but it's not true. This is a very old program. You don't even have to install it. You have formulas. You don't really have any creative tools. It's by itself very boring. It looks very boring. But again, not knowing what you're doing isn't really a problem most of the times when playing with these programs. So you just go through these kind of formulas as long as until you get something interesting. I'm not getting anything interesting. Let's try this one. And yeah, you got a navigator. This is not a good example, I'm sorry. I need some kind of 3D structure. Okay, here we go. I've got this navigator, which I can cruise around. It's a 3D environment. This is an actual fractal. If you know some kind of mathematics around it, you could have some more controls over it, but it doesn't really matter because as long as you tweak everything, you always end up with something. And you can make images with this program, you can make animations with this program, but that's not really the point here. What I'm showing is the ray tracing aspect of it. You can just have your frame being translated and calculated. You can import it here and it generates the 3D informations. And you can just export it here in these formats. I'm really sorry. It's my throat, it's killing me. And yeah, you can just play around with this forever. You have so many formulas to play around with. Even though you don't know how anything works, something will come up. And here's the test I made a couple of minutes ago. It's gonna take a few seconds. Yeah. So yeah, I had to do 0 modeling, 0 sculpting, 0 complicated networking. I just combined some formulas and I got this. It might not be the nicest, most organic, most interesting thing, but it's something. It has some kind of harmony to it. And I think I want to see 3D as this kind of archive that keeps growing. You just generate and keep generating things, and you keep combining the things you keep generating, and then you come up with your own palette of meshes and objects. Okay. Last thing I want to discuss is Blender. I talked about it already, and stop me if I'm going over time. I'm not keeping track.
That's fine. 5 minutes.
And, okay, great. So I'm just gonna. Oh wait, no. Blender. I really like the idea of importing, like these, for example, these objects I generate on something like Mandelbulb, import them to Blender, and compose compose new objects, and then import them in TouchDesigner, and keeping TouchDesigner as the final pipeline. If you are interested in Blender, I can't stress this enough. You need to subscribe to this channel. It's called the Midje Sinaeve. I'm not good at spelling it. How do I? This guy, if you wanna get into procedural art on Blender, this is the guy this is everything you will ever need. It really covers everything you ever wanna do on something like Blender. And lastly, I'm gonna show you my performance setup. And everything I showed you up to this point ends up being some sort of clip, which I can use and just keep here in my enormous network of videos. And I know this doesn't look good and probably not clever at all. There are probably much more clever ways to have so many clips arranged. but I like this approach. I have every switch, every video is turned on or off by a knob on my video control that I have here. And I just switch between all of this. I'm gonna use my mouse because I don't have my control attached. So here you can see some examples of what I just showed. This was done on TouchDesigner for the animation, but the model was made, these models were made with Mandelbulb and Blender. This was done doing the first example, turning a 3D into 2D on TouchDesigner. And these are, okay. I think I can also, I think I can stop right now because I'm, yeah, that's the gist. I as you can see, to repeat everything, I just like to not focus entirely on TouchDesigner when approaching 3D because I simply don't have the knowledge for it. And I know you can get into very, very cool territories with 3D using only TouchDesigner. And by the way, this is the best example of limiting yourself to TouchDesigner. 4040, I think, is one of the best, among the best artists out there using only TouchDesigner. I really envy this kind of talent. But as long as you don't have, until you don't have this kind of knowledge, just play around with what you have and try to expand as much as possible your knowledge of as many programs as you can. And I think the most interesting ideas come up from overlap. So yeah, thanks everybody for your attention.
This is what I go by on Instagram. So if anyone has ever seen what I do before, it's probably here. So if my name is unfamiliar, that's because I don't really use it on socials. But for our purposes here, my name is Billy Tegethoff. So I had to revise what I was going to present a little bit just because I kind of misread the prompt. So I didn't know that it was going to be a 15 to 20 minute presentation. So what I had initially wanted to do is kind of take a look at some more complex camera animations inside TouchDesigner using the animation comp, but that takes a long time. And yeah, so not going to do that. What I'm going to do instead is I still want to talk about some more complex camera animation techniques. But I'm gonna confine it to, I guess, more generative based camera movements rather than manually keyframing everything. So, so what I'm going to talk about is this project here. I apologize if it's laggy. I did try to adjust my screen resolution to make it a little better, but what we're looking at here is there is audio that's driving a lot of this sort of watery texture going on. But since we're on Zoom, I'm not going to play that back through the speakers. It'll just be a mess. So before we kind of get into the project here, let me just note the time so I don't go over. I do want to talk about one thing that I discovered kind of recently that I thought was handy, so I just want to share it here. So I didn't know why using a null comp as a look at in a render network actually worked. I just had seen it in tutorials and thought, okay, well, I guess if I want my camera to be focused on a central point, I need to have a null comp as my look at in my camera here. But anyway, the reason that it works, and I'm sure some of you already know this, but I I just found this out recently. The whole reason it works is because within the null comp, we actually have X, Y, and Z coordinates in our 3D environment here. So in the null comp, X, Y, and Z are set to 0, 0, and 0. So that means if we're using this as our look at in the camera, it's always going to be focused on the origin. Now, what you can do with that information and where this gets kind of interesting is you can animate your look at point. So if you don't want it to always look at the origin, for instance, kind of the simplest version of animating it that can get kind of a cool handheld camera look is using the mouse in chop and then animating your X and Y coordinates on there. So I did that ahead of time. So you can just kind of see what's going on here. As I move my mouse, where my camera is looking changes accordingly. So just to cover how I did that real quick, if you grab a mouse in chop from your menu here, wherever it is, there it is. Bang it out to a null and then add a math to adjust the range depending on how drastic you want your movements to be. You can then just activate the viewer there and drag your TX value onto, not the camera, onto your look at in here, select chop reference, and then do the same thing with Y. And there you go. We have some slightly more interesting camera movements depending on what kind of aesthetic you're going for. So anyway, just want to talk about that real quick before we talk about the rest of the 3D stuff going on here. Okay, so I want to talk about just what's going on in this project a little bit because there are a few different 3D techniques. And then there's some post-render feedback stuff going on that's essentially responsible for the audio reactivity. But let me just go ahead and bypass all that so we can see a little more clearly what's going on here. So what we have here are just a couple of, really it's just a sphere and two toruses, although it obviously doesn't look like it's just a sphere and two toruses. So what we have going on as far as 3D techniques is we have our just basic shapes defined over on this side of the network. We have our sphere here, we have one torus here, we have our second torus here. And then what's going on is these are all being fed into particle SOPs. So that's what's responsible for a lot of this behavior that's happening. So on the sphere, what's going on is it's, turn this viewer on. There we go. So let's check out what's going on in here. Just so you can see what I've done here to set this up. When you start with a particle SOP, it can be a little harder to see. So I go to display options and turn points on here, and that'll make it a little more obvious what's going on. I got a couple things going on here that are different than the defaults. This can create some really interesting looks, just putting a sort in between your initial geometry SOP and your particle SOP. You can create all kinds of different looks. Right now it's sorting by where pixels lie on the Z axis. So it's moving from negative Z to positive Z, and you get kind of this, this sort of pulsing look. But there are all sorts of different sort options. If you do random, it'll just kind of look like everything is spitting out from the origin. I do closest neighbor, which looks pretty cool, but it's also extremely CPU heavy. And this is already a pretty CPU heavy project, so I'm just gonna leave that there. The other thing to know about particle systems created with the particle SOP is that if you go in the third input here, you can use a meta ball and a force SOP to also make it do some pretty interesting stuff. So I have a meta ball here, which is not really doing anything terribly exciting in and of itself, other than just existing and being bigger than this sphere. So my main sphere has a radius of 1. My meta ball is bigger. That's what allows it to affect this. If I had the meta ball either at the same size or smaller than the sphere, we might not see any of the forces applied having any effect. So what's going on with this one is there's a radial force applied, but it's very gentle. So let me just show you something a little more drastic you can do with this. If you turn directional force on and then change which axis you want it to relate to, you can start cranking these and get some really interesting behavior. And then just to tie it in with a lot of something that I'm sure a lot of you are interested in with audio reactivity or something to that effect, you can animate the level of this force, or you can animate the amount it's going to be applied in the negative Z direction in this case. So you can get, I'm not going to do it right now, but for instance, if you were to drag something from an audio chop in here, you could have it animating your vortex force or your spiral force. All right, so that's what's going on with the sphere. One of the other cool things that tends to be kind of handy with particle stuff is that if you keep the birth count relatively low, just in the hundreds in this case, you get these really sparse kind of, I'm not even sure what you'd call it, but it's this thing that's happening in the background. And what that can do is it can take something as simple as a torus and turn it into something much more compelling. So right now we have this torus being animated and just rotating around the origin. But since the birth count on the particles is very low, it's not always birthing them in the same location. So you don't get a static torus, you get this kind of strange undulating wave pattern of these circles. And part of the way to make that happen or to adjust the density of these is just to mess with the number of rows and columns in your initial SOP here. Okay, and then lastly on our geometry here, we have a third torus, but we have significantly more density in terms of the number of columns and rows. I left the rows the same, but it has 500 columns. And then it is also rotating, but it's rotating about a different axis. So, and then we also have different sort behavior, which is what is resulting in these sort of strange cones that are moving around our sphere. So pretty interesting. I've spent a lot of time working with these particle systems just because it's really cool what they can do to basic shapes. And then real quick, before we move over to the render network and the camera stuff, I just wanted to talk about, this kind of ties in with what Thomas was talking about as well. Just working with 3D models outside that come from outside of TouchDesigner, because you can still apply all of these techniques to quite a few different types of models, but probably the easiest ones to work with are .obj files. I like to, rather than using the point file in, I typically will just use a file in SOP, which you actually don't even need to set that up. If you have a .obj file, let me just see what I can find here. There we go. So if you have a .obj file, you can just drag it right off of your desktop or out of your Finder or whatever the Windows equivalent is, right into TouchDesigner, and it will just pop up as a file in. The reason I like to use this is because when we go to do geometry instancing, we get a few more things to work with. We also, in addition to just our X, Y, and Z values, we also get normals. So that comes in handy when you have something like a face or a body, particularly if you're instancing with, I know everything I have here are spheres, so it doesn't really make any difference with spheres, but say you're instancing with rectangles or boxes, for instance, having the normals in your instance network can make everything conform much better to your source geometry. Basically, it will take all your boxes or rectangles and face them in the direction of essentially the textures here. I'm not that great at explaining what that means. I believe the normals are essentially just perpendicular vectors to every single face on here, and it will associate all of your instances with the direction of every surface on here. So you can get something really interesting like a particle system, but the source of it will still look like this. So that's kind of cool if you want to have, you know, a 3D object melt or something like that, but look like itself before it starts. And then just to show you how to apply this technique to something like this, you can just, if I just drag my wire from this head mesh into our sort, we now have the head in there instead of the sphere. Similar with the body. I added these transform stops in here as well, just because these 3D models were not quite the right size for this. So I did that ahead of time, but there you go. We now see some pretty interesting behavior with some 3D models generated outside of TouchDesigner. Put the sphere back. All right, so let's see, got a couple minutes left. So one thing I did want to talk about, let me go ahead and reconnect all of my post-render stuff just because it looks cooler. One other thing I did want to talk about is this chop setup right here. I use it in almost every project now. It's something I learned from, I can't remember his actual name, but his Instagram handle is Polyhop. He has a looping noise tutorial. Simon, there we go. Yeah, okay. But yeah, his looping noise tutorial talks about using 4D noise and using this particular chop setup to animate the noise in a loop. I've used it for all kinds of stuff, including that, but also animating camera movements, controlling this is controlling the rotation of my SOPs over here. And what the hell am I talking about with this? Why am I excited about this? Basically what it does is it will take whatever the length of your timeline is, divide it by whatever frame you're currently on, and then it combines it with essentially it's similar to Bileam's method of animating camera movements with LFOs. When you have two LFOs that are a particular amount out of phase, it creates a circular pattern. You can do the same thing using a sine wave and a cosine wave. They're already the proper amount out of phase. And when you merge them together and then throw them into a lookup chop here, you get these two channels that are driving movements in a circular pattern, but they're also going to end at the same place they began in your timeline to begin with. So I think this is a great tool for all kinds of stuff. In this project, like I said, I'm using it to manage the rotation of these toruses. I'm also using it to animate my camera movements. I'm also using it to do some other stuff that I'm going to cover in my last couple minutes here. So in my camera comp here in my render network, a very common type of camera movement in TouchDesigner is just having your camera rotate in a circle about whatever is in the middle of your project here. Again, using that look at assignment to make sure that it's pointing at the middle of your project. It's just kind of nice to use this looping setup to animate that. It always goes from -1 to 1, so I can just apply whatever distance I want. I can just multiply it by that, and I'll still have that nice circular motion. And then the added bonus is that it will end where it begins based on the length of my timeline. Now, like I said, this is an audio reactive thing. You can see Bileam's audio analysis deck in here. So this is a long timeline at the moment. It's the length of the song that's driving everything audio reactive in here. But if you make this shorter, for instance, if we only wanted it to be 30 seconds, you'll notice everything is going to speed up. So that's kind of handy, just depending on the application. But I like it mostly because regardless of how long my timeline is, everything is going to start and end in the same point. So you can get some really pretty looping animations just using this setup, and it's good for a lot more than just looping 4D noise. Put that back, and I'll leave it. Now, as far as getting some slightly more interesting, and I guess it's not exactly generative, it's still pretty math-based camera movements rather than just circling, there's a couple things I like to do that are pretty simple. If I get rid of what's happening in my Y translate value here, you'll see we're moving in kind of the conventional circle. Actually, kill this too, I'm not there yet. So right now what's happening is we're just moving in a circle at, I'm not sure what the units are here, but whatever, 23 somethings away from our origin. And nothing else is moving. So one of the things I like to do to just spice it up and make it a little more interesting is add something in my Y translate value. This is of course to taste, but typically I like to have whatever distance is applied to my X and Y somewhere in the neighborhood, or I'm sorry, my X and Z, somewhere in the neighborhood of half of that in my Y. And then you just get some kind of gentle up and down as the animation progresses. The other thing that I like to do to make it a little more interesting without having to do anything like manual keyframing is I like to animate my FOV angle. And so again, with this chop setup up here, I'm just using a select chop coming out of my lookup here, grabbing the channel 2 out of it, and then I have a little math chop right here, just selecting the range, and you can figure out what looks good depending on the project just by grabbing this and sliding it around and saying, okay, well, if I go out to 100, I don't really like that, but if I stay, okay, 80-ish, that's pretty cool. And if I come into 2, that's, I don't necessarily want to be in that close. Maybe I want, okay, something like that. Anyway, figure out your values and then go into a math chop and set that as the range. And then we have, again, some kind of subtle camera movements that are a little more interesting than just going in a flat circle around this. There we go. That's about all I got. Maybe just one other thing before I wrap up, just talking about some stuff you can do when you've instanced particles. I kind of like all of my particles to have a somewhat reflective look to them. And it costs a lot in terms of CPU when you use an environment light, but I love the way it looks, and I don't mind rendering things out and posting them later. So just real quick, the way to get that look is to use an environment light. And then I like to use an HDRI or an EXR file, which you can find. There are a bunch of them online. I can't remember where I got this one, but what it does is it's just a distorted image that will map well onto a sphere. So I use that and then put that as the environment map, and then use a PBR. And the way to get it to be reflective using a PBR is just to drag the roughness value all the way to 0. And then each one of these particles is now reflecting this particular environment. So even though it's in a black background and there's really nothing real for it to reflect, it still appears to have some degree of reflectivity. These spheres are all reflecting something, which is a look that I like a lot personally. So anyway, there you go. There's a bunch of post-render stuff that if anyone's interested in, we can talk about in the breakout rooms. That's kind of where most of the audio reactivity is happening. So that's that for me.
All right. Amazing. Thank you. Have you tried working with attraction on the particles too? I think that's really fun as well. Like attracting from different geometries, basically. So you can like guide particles from points to other points.
I have a bit, although I've kind of focused more on applying forces to them in a different project. Let's see if that's easily accessible. But you can get kind of a cool attractor-like look, this one, using just the spiral and vortex forces and stationing your geometry appropriately. So this looks like there's an attraction going on to what's happening in the middle here, but it's actually just a vortex coming off of all of these shapes. So yes, I have, and it's something I need to do more of, but it's this is just kind of the route I've personally taken on it.
Yeah, it's great that you're basing everything on the song length. It makes a lot of sense. It's a cool way to use that technique of Simon. Good job. Really cool.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is Kim Dae-Cheon. I live in Seoul. It is raining, and I want to say about my not good English skills. So, and if you, anyway, I just want to show my work. Okay, that's the most better choice to me. Okay, right. So I'm an architect and artist in South Korea. I did like this kind of audiovisual stuff, something generative city, whatever. This is the project of 아시아 Cultural Center, 뭐 시네마 펀드라고 이렇게 project something, the 2D generative graphic and something generative grid, and making this pattern to the 3D. And the other project is like this. I use function in TD TouchDesigners, the blob track, and the video in movement, someone block track and there something like make effect like rendering something. Okay, this is some my recent work, and what I'm doing in what I'm doing it anyway. But recently I share my studies about TouchDesigner's 3D modeling in Instagram and YouTube tutorials, how to make the 3D geometry modeling like this ordinary or usually object, and you can find if whatever. Okay, so I want to introduce my work in today is sorry. So let me show you. I want to show my recent study first. This is the only created geometry TouchDesigner. It is start rectangular and.
We're just seeing your Instagram, by the way.
Yes.
Okay.
And this is, if I adjusting size, it could be changed how many column and.
Are we supposed to see your Instagram right now?
Oh, Instagram? Sorry, pardon?
Are we supposed to see your Instagram right now? Because we just see you scrolling down Instagram.
Ah, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. And this is the temple, what I make in TouchDesigner. Only created, start from rectangle, soft, what we can make here, rectangle. And in rectangle, I can change the size and automatically the column divide and copy, then make the temple like that. And another thing is building the office tower. It is this is also made it TouchDesigner tube and tubes, and these tubes are each have some parts about the slab part, and they are divided and copy. They have a beam. So this procedure make this building, and it could be animated like this. And the other thing is my secret weapon. Okay, the car. The car is made it from this grid. The grid, they make the car shape. And I think the car has some kind of type of this kind of car, and this kind of car, maybe truck. So if I change car switch, okay. Car switch, like it changed type car. Whatever. If I did this switch and group and some primitive and subdivide it and clip and make a hole for fill, and fill make process, then separate the window and framing. Kind of this process, and separate for material process. Then I can get this result. And what I wanting is some this kind of interaction with some of the other input. Okay, and this is my recent TouchDesigner 3D research, and I want to show you today hammer and saw. So this two geometry is my research, my new get whatever, something like this tubes is also have this, how can I say, this kind of did I don't know, but
Head.
that is parameter. They have a parameter, and could be change head. So they have a head. 1, 2, 3. So this shape is just bat, and this is hammer, and this is I don't know, just mushroom. I don't know. And there are change like any kind of variable. So I want to this geometry can, I want to say this geometrical modeling will be different and create different object like spoon or guitar or some whatever the stick and something whatever have. So this is the, I think the archetype something, and the other is soul. The soul is something more complex because it has 2 dimensions. I can show you how this works. Oh, this is not some size. And could be changed. Change some proportion. And something detail adjustment. Like this. This saw has also 2 parts. This part is handle, and this part is knife. And there are some, I think I need some cleaning time, but sorry. So this is, you can see how to model I did. So this type of geometry modeling is 2-dimensional, some kind of, if the hammer type has some stick and something. So this saw type has some handle and flat surface and top. Oh, this what teeth? How could I say? So they have many parts. So, and this part are controlled by that so it could be change table 10 or like that 30, of course 1 2 and it could be adjust the orientation of teeth. I don't know. And I think this kind of modeling concept can be reached to make some kind of complex shape like piano, or I already use in car modeling this concept, the 2-dimensional separation, and make some kind of this part has field, this part has window, this part has some the other transformation. So I want to this kind of tutorial, some kind of create something in TouchDesigner tutorial. I will upload I have a plan. I will uploading this kind of tutorial, and you can check my Instagram, SNS, or YouTube address, and you can make heartbeat example. Oh. So this is, I want to recommend, if you have interesting like my study, and if you want some make or create in TouchDesigner for concrete shape, like this kind of heart or car or building, I recommend see my tutorial. Okay, I'm very tired because I don't have enough English. Sorry. Okay.
All right.
Okay, this my presentation is here, and thank you.
All right, thank you so much. That's really, really inspiring. I haven't seen any sub work like that